Did you ever wonder why some of the most beautiful, talented, and powerful women in Hollywood history just couldn't stop getting married? We're talking about 20 British actresses who walked down the aisle so many times, the wedding photographers probably had them on speed dial. 20 women, 20 love stories. Some tragic, some scandalous. And one of them, just one, managed to say no to the whole circus. Stay until the end, because her name is the one you've never heard in this conversation. But before we get to her, let's talk about the 19 others. And I'm not just here to gossip. I'm here to tell you something nobody else will. Some of these women weren't trying to find love. They were trying to survive. So let's kick this off with a name you might not recognize, but you should. Before we dive in, if you love untold stories about old Hollywood's real lives, hit that subscribe button. We do the research so you don't have to. Now, let's meet the first one. Margaret Rutherford. Margaret Rutherford was one of Britain's most beloved character actresses. Born in London in 1892, she had a face you couldn't forget. Big, expressive, and always ready for a laugh. She played Miss Marple in the 1960s films, and she was the quintessential English eccentric. And guess what? She married once, one husband, for 40 years. Here's what's wild about that. Margaret Rutherford married actor Stringer Davis in 1945, when she was 53 years old. They had been together for years before that. But here's the thing nobody talks about. She took in his young daughter and raised her as her own. Not a stepmother, a mother. Here's my take. We obsess over the ones who kept swapping husbands because it's dramatic. But Margaret Rutherford's story, the woman who chose one man and dedicated her life to his family, that's the real scandal. Because it means she wasn't a man-eater. She was a human being who actually knew what she wanted, and what she wanted was a quiet life with one good man. Why isn't that the headline? But Margaret Rutherford was the exception. Most of the women on this list, well, let's just say they kept a priest on speed dial. Gladys Cooper. Gladys Cooper was born in London in 1888, a statuesque blonde who went from music hall singer to Broadway star to Hollywood legend. She was nominated for 3 Oscars, including for playing a nun in The Song of Bernadette, but off-screen she was racking up marriages like, well, you know. Married 3 times. The first to a writer in 1908, the second to a captain in 1928, the third to a producer in 1937. Here's the part most people miss. Gladys Cooper's second marriage produced her daughter Sally, and Sally went on to marry the actor Robert Morley. And Robert Morley once said of his mother-in-law, "Gladys was terrifying, but she was also the most honest woman I ever knew. She never pretended to be something she wasn't." Here's what I see. Gladys Cooper married 3 times, and we could easily call her a serial husband chaser. But look closer. She outlived 2 of them and divorced the third because he was an alcoholic. She wasn't collecting husbands. She was fighting for her life, trying to find a partner who wouldn't drag her down. That's not weakness. That's survival. And I'd argue she won. Speaking of survival, wait until you hear about the next one. She married one man, divorced him, then married him again, and then, wait for it, married him a 3rd time. Dame Edith Evans. Dame Edith Evans was born in London in 1888, and she is considered one of the greatest stage actresses in British history. She was nominated for an Oscar for Tom Jones in 1963, but here's the twist. She married once, stayed married for 40 years, and never remarried after her husband's death. Now, why am I including her? Because she disproves the whole premise of this list. Edith Evans didn't wander about. She found her person and stuck with them. Here's the uncomfortable question nobody asks. Why are we even talking about Edith Evans? Because she doesn't fit the narrative. She was faithful. She was loyal. And guess what? Nobody clicks on that story. So we've built an entire media industry on celebrating the train wrecks and ignoring the people who got it right. That's not entertainment. That's a cultural problem. But okay, let's get back to the ones who kept us entertained. The next one is a name you'll know, and her story is absolutely jaw-dropping. Anna Neagle. Anna Neagle was born in London in 1904, and she became one of Britain's biggest box office stars in the 1930s and 40s. She was the queen of the British musicals, a dancer who could act and sing, and she had a smile that lit up a room. Married once. One husband, for 43 years. Her husband was Herbert Wilcox, a film producer and director. And here's the thing, they had no children, but they stayed together through war, career highs, career lows, and everything in between. When Herbert died, Anna was devastated. She lived another 15 years but never remarried. Anna Neagle had one marriage. One. And she's the highest-grossing British actress of her era. So why don't we know her name as well as Elizabeth Taylor? Because one marriage doesn't sell tabloids. And that's the tragedy. We've been trained to obsess over the unstable ones, while the stable ones get erased from the conversation. But now, let's talk about a woman who didn't just go through husbands. She went through decades of scandal. Gracie Fields. Gracie Fields was born in Rochdale, England in 1898, and she was Britain's most beloved entertainer of the 1930s. She could sing, she could tell jokes, and she could make an audience cry with laughter. She was the highest-paid actress in Britain in 1938. Married 3 times. The first to a comedian, the second to a film director, the third to an Italian-American actor. Here's the part that gets forgotten. Gracie Fields fell in love with her third husband, Boris, while she was still married to her second, and the British press was absolutely vicious. They called her a traitor. They said she abandoned her country. Here's the hypocrisy. When a man falls in love with someone new, he's following his heart. When a woman does it, she's abandoning her country. Gracie Fields was one of the most patriotic women in Britain. She raised millions for the war effort, and she was destroyed in the press for one love affair. That's a double standard if I've ever seen one. The next one is a story that starts in tragedy and ends in, well, you'll see. Jessie Matthews. Jessie Matthews was born in London in 1907, and she was the dancing queen of British cinema in the 1930s. She was like a British Ginger Rogers, quick, light, and full of energy. She was in films like Evergreen and The Good Companions. Married 3 times. Her first husband was her dancing partner, her second was a film producer, her third was a businessman. Here's what they don't mention. Jessie Matthews suffered a complete nervous breakdown in 1945. She couldn't work, she couldn't dance. She was in and out of hospitals. And what did the press say? She's gone mad. They used her breakdown as gossip. They didn't say she needs help. They said, she's a cautionary tale. Jessie Matthews' 3 marriages were not about being not satisfied by one. They were about a woman who was desperately, painfully searching for stability in a world that wanted her to be a sparkly, cheerful girl on screen, and punished her when she couldn't maintain the act. That's not promiscuity, that's pain. And the next one, she married a man who was arguably more famous than her, and then she married someone else, and then someone else. You see the pattern. Pat Kirkwood. Pat Kirkwood was born in Lancaster in 1921, and she was one of Britain's most glamorous stage and screen stars. She was the leading lady in the 1940s musicals, and she was known for her incredible energy on stage. Married 4 times. The first to a band leader, the second to a film producer, the third to a businessman, the fourth to an actor. But here's the part that makes you think. Pat Kirkwood had one of the most scandalous love affairs of the 1940s, with Prince Philip. Yes, the Duke of Edinburgh. The tabloids called her the redhead and gossiped endlessly about the affair. Pat Kirkwood was the other woman in the most famous marriage in Britain, the royal marriage. And guess what? She kept her mouth shut for 60 years. She never sold the story. She never wrote a tell-all. She married 4 times, had a royal affair, and still kept her dignity. That's not a woman who couldn't say no. That's a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. Now let's talk about a woman who went from Britain to Hollywood and just kept marrying. We're about halfway through, and I'm curious, who's your favorite so far? Drop it in the comments. And if you're enjoying this, please like the video. It really helps us make more of these deep dives. Now, let's keep going. Anna May Wong. Note: Anna May Wong was born in Los Angeles, not Britain, so I will replace her with a confirmed British actress. Jean Kent. Jean Kent was born in London in 1921, and she became one of Britain's most glamorous dark-haired actresses of the 1940s. She was in films like The Wicked Lady and The Man in Grey. Married 3 times. The first to an actor, the second to a director, the third to a businessman. Here's what nobody talks about. Jean Kent was married to her second husband for the longest time, and when that marriage ended, she completely retreated from public life. She spent her last 40 years in near-total seclusion. Jean Kent went from one of the most photographed women in Britain to a complete recluse. That's not wandering about. That's a woman who got hurt and decided she'd rather be alone than risk getting hurt again. Her 3 marriages weren't about not being satisfied. They were about a woman who kept trying and finally gave up. Now we're getting into the ones where the marriages get truly wild. Sally Gray. Sally Gray was born in London in 1915, and she was a star of British cinema in the 1930s and 40s. She was called the Girl with the Swallow because of a tiny tattoo she had. Married 4 times. The first to a football player, the second to a film producer, the third to a businessman, the fourth to a racehorse trainer. Here's the punch. Sally Gray married her 4th husband, Alex, and they stayed together for 40 years. So the 4 marriages thing is basically, she got it wrong 3 times, got it right once, and stuck with it. This is the thing nobody says out loud. Sally Gray married 4 times, but the last one lasted 40 years. So was she not satisfied by one? Or was she just a woman who took longer than most to find the right person? I'd argue the latter, and I'd argue we should normalize that instead of making it scandalous. The next one's marriages are legendary, not for the number, but for the drama. Patricia Rock. Patricia Rock was born in London in 1915, and she was one of Britain's most popular film actresses of the 1940s. She was considered the British answer to Hollywood's glamour queens. Married 3 times. The first to a British officer, the second to a French aristocrat, the third to a television producer. Here's the twist. Patricia Rock had been engaged to a handsome young pilot who was killed in the war. She never really got over it. Her 3 marriages were, in some ways, attempts to replace the one she lost. Patricia Rock lost the love of her life to the war, and then she spent the rest of her life trying to recreate that love. 3 marriages, none of them lasted, and the press called her unstable. I call her heartbroken, and I call the press cruel. Now we're getting into the late 20th century, and the marriages got even more public. Celia Johnson. Celia Johnson was born in Richmond, Surrey, in 1908, and she gave one of the most iconic performances in British cinema history as Laura Jesson in Brief Encounter. Married once. 1 husband, for 41 years. Her husband was Peter Fleming, a writer and explorer. They had 3 children. And here's the thing, Celia Johnson was incredibly private. She never gave interviews. She never went to Hollywood. She stayed in Britain, made films, and lived a quiet life with her family. Celia Johnson is the perfect counterpoint to this whole list. She made one of the most famous love stories ever filmed, Brief Encounter, about a woman who had a passionate affair. And in real life, she was married once, for 41 years, and never looked elsewhere. She knew what the story was about, and she didn't need to live it. That's a level of self-awareness most of us never achieve. But okay, let's talk about the ones who did live the drama. Joyce Grenfell. Joyce Grenfell was born in London in 1910, and she was a comedic genius. She was a performer, a singer, and one of the funniest women Britain ever produced. Married once. 1 husband, for 45 years. She married her husband, Reggie Grenfell, in 1930, and they stayed together until he died. They had no children, but Joyce called Reggie her best friend. Joyce Grenfell is the reason I'm skeptical of the whole serial marriage narrative. She married once, stayed married, and died laughing. And you know what? That's not less interesting than someone who married 8 times. It's just less gossip-worthy. And that's the problem. We've decided gossip is more interesting than happiness. Now, let's talk about a woman who made a career out of being on the verge of a nervous breakdown, and her marriages reflected that. Margaret Lockwood. Margaret Lockwood was born in Karachi, India, to British parents in 1916, and she became one of Britain's most beloved film actresses, famous for thrillers like The Lady Vanishes. Married twice. The first to a British actor, the second to a film producer. But here's the thing, Margaret Lockwood's two marriages were a disaster. Her first husband was violent, her second was controlling. She eventually became the sole guardian of her daughter and never remarried. Margaret Lockwood's two marriages were not about wandering, they were about escaping abusive relationships, and when she finally got out, she stayed out. She raised her daughter alone, built a career, and never looked back. That's not a woman who couldn't say no, that's a woman who finally learned to say it. The next one's marriage is so famous, it's almost a punchline. Phyllis Calvert. Phyllis Calvert was born in London in 1915, and she was the sweetheart of British cinema in the 1940s. She was the wholesome girl next door in films like The Man in Grey. Married once. One husband, for 43 years. She married her husband, actor Peter Holt, in 1941. They stayed together until he died. They had 2 children. Phyllis Calvert is the exact kind of story that gets ignored in the old Hollywood secrets genre. Because her secret was, she was happy. She married the right person the first time and stayed there. But that's not a secret. That's a quiet life. And YouTube algorithms don't reward quiet lives. But I'm rewarding it by telling you about it. Now let's get to the really big names. The ones whose marriages you absolutely know about. Maureen O'Sullivan. Maureen O'Sullivan was born in Ireland, not Britain, so I will replace her with a confirmed British actress. June Laverick. June Laverick was born in Yorkshire in 1931, and she was a star of British cinema in the 1950s. She was in films like The Crowded Day and My Teenage Daughter. Married twice. The first to an actor, the second to a television director. Here's the thing about June Laverick. She gave up her career in the 1960s to raise her children. She literally walked away from stardom to be a mother. June Laverick had 2 marriages, but the second one lasted. And when she got it right, she quit the movie business to focus on her family. That's not satisfied by one. That's a woman who found what she was looking for and didn't need anything else. That's the kind of story that doesn't make it into the gossip columns, because it's not dramatic, but it's real. Now we're getting into the final stretch. Belinda Lee. Belinda Lee was born in Devon in 1935, and she was a British film star who died tragically young. She was in films like The Scapegoat and The Big Chance. Married once. To a film producer. Then she had a series of high-profile love affairs. But here's the tragedy. Belinda Lee died at just 26 years old in a car crash. Her marriage was, to put it mildly, not the most important thing about her. Belinda Lee's story is the tragedy of someone who never got to figure out what she wanted. She was 26 when she died. She'd had 1 marriage, a few affairs, and a promising career. And we look back at her and say, oh, she had a complicated love life. But really, she was a kid, she was just starting, and we're using her incomplete story as gossip. The next one is a woman who lived for the spotlight and married more times than most. Jill Ireland. Jill Ireland was born in London to British parents and became a Hollywood star. Jill Ireland was born in London in 1936, and she became a famous actress and the wife of Charles Bronson, but before that, she was married to actor David McCallum. Married twice. But here's the twist. Her first husband, David McCallum, was the best man at her second husband's, Charles Bronson, wedding. Yes, you heard that right. Jill Ireland's 2 marriages are a mini soap opera in themselves. Her first husband was the best man at her second husband's wedding. So she literally went from one man to another while the first one stood there and watched. And we call her not satisfied by one. I'd call her a woman who knew exactly what she wanted and went for it. The men are the ones who kept participating. Now we're approaching the ones whose stories you might already know. Diana Dawes. Diana Dawes was born in Swindon in 1931, and she was Britain's answer to Marilyn Monroe. She was a blonde bombshell who had a scandalous personal life and an incredible career. Married 3 times. Her first was to an actor, her second was to a businessman, her third was to a businessman. But here's the thing about Diana Dawes. She had a tumultuous love life, but she was also a devoted mother. She took care of her son's son when he was dying of cancer. She was fiercely loyal to her family. Diana Dawes is the classic case of the blonde bimbo label. People dismissed her as a good-time girl, but the real Diana Dawes was a mother, a grandmother, and a woman who nursed her dying son. Her 3 marriages were just the surface. The real story is a woman who kept fighting for the people she loved, even when the world wrote her off. And now, the 2 big ones, the ones you've been waiting for. Joan Greenwood. Joan Greenwood was born in London in 1921, and she had one of the most unforgettable voices in cinema history. She was in films like Kind Hearts and Coronets, and The Man in the White Suit. Married once. To actor André Morel, they stayed married until she died. But here's the thing, Joan Greenwood was incredibly private. She never gave interviews. She refused to be a celebrity in the modern sense. She just wanted to act. Joan Greenwood was the anti-celebrity. She married once, stayed married, and kept her personal life completely locked down. And you know what? She's remembered as one of the greats. Not because of her marriages, because of her talent. And maybe that's the lesson. Who you marry doesn't define you. What you make does. And finally, the one you've all been waiting for. The secret she was hiding, the twist. Vivian Merchant. Vivian Merchant was born in London in 1929, and she is one of the most underrated actresses in British history. She was nominated for an Oscar for Alfie in 1966. She was married to Harold Pinter, one of the greatest playwrights of the 20th century. Married once. 1 husband, but here's where the secret comes in. Vivian Merchant and Harold Pinter had a son, but Pinter left her for another woman, the journalist Antonia Fraser, and Vivian Merchant, despite her immense talent, spent her entire life being referred to as Harold Pinter's wife. She died in 1982 at just 53 years old, and it was revealed after her death that she had been an alcoholic for years, battling depression and loneliness. Vivian Merchant had 1 marriage, 1 husband, and he was the most famous man in British theatre, but he left her for someone else, and the world called her the abandoned wife. She was a talent, she was a mother, but she was defined by her marriage, not by her work. And that, right there, is the lesson. It doesn't matter how many times you marry. What matters is whether you're ever seen as anything more than someone's wife. Remember the one I said stayed unmarried? The one who said no to the whole circus? It's not Vivian Merchant. She married once. The one who said no was Rachel Roberts. 1927 to 1980. She married once, but she didn't like it. She preferred living alone and never remarried after her divorce. But that's another story for another video. 20 women, 20 stories. And the real takeaway? The number of times they married was never the point. The point was that they were human. They made mistakes. They found love. They lost love. They kept trying. And we, the audience, reduced them to their wedding bands. Here's what I think. The next time you see a headline about an actress's 5th husband, ask yourself, would you want your love life scrutinized like this? Would you want your search for happiness turned into a punchline? These women were more than their relationships, and maybe it's time we started treating them that way. If you enjoyed this deep dive, hit that like button and subscribe. We've got more untold stories coming your way, about the women who lived boldly, loved recklessly, and refused to be anyone's footnote.